The American Yawp. Chapter 2. Making an Atlantic World. Section 8. Spanish North America. The great wealth from Spanish America was centered in Central and South America, but Spain ventured north as well. As mestizo societies developed in the mining and urban centers, privately financed military expeditions, called entradas, were organized to find other indigenous empires to plunder. Led by veteran conquistadors, these expeditions included hundreds of soldiers, priests, guides, and enslaved people, supported by enormous numbers of livestock. Juan Ponce de Leon, the conqueror of Puerto Rico, landed in Florida in 1513 in search of gold and enslaved laborers. The reality of staunch indigenous resistance and a swampy coastline never aligned with Ponce de Leon's imagination, and in Florida, he found only an early grave, courtesy of a poisoned arrow by the Calusa peoples. With the exploration of the Gulf of Mexico and the coast of California between the 1520s and 1540s, as the contours of the North American mainland came into focus, others tried where Ponce de Leon had failed. In 1528, Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca joined Panfilo de Narvaez's expedition from Cuba to find the Rio de las Palmas, 125 miles south of the Rio Grande. But due to consecutive storms and the powerful Gulf Stream, they erroneously landed on the west coast of Florida. After being separated from their supply ships, they built rafts in hopes of sailing again to their destination. Unfortunately, the crew shipwrecked on the coast of present-day Texas and embarked on a remarkable multi-year odyssey that took them from the Texas coast all the way to Sonora. This epic trek further spread diseases and led to a host of disasters due to language barriers and the Spaniards' insistence on their superiority. For example, when the explorers encountered the Tocobaga in the Tampa Bay area, they found shipwrecked European crates, each containing a dead body. The Tocobaga had treated the deceased Europeans with respect by carefully wrapping them in valuable painted skins, but Fray Juan Suarez, the accompanying bishop, misinterpreted the act as devilish idolatry and had the crates and bodies burned, despite being on sacred ground. Afterward, relations between the Spaniards and Tocobaga quickly deteriorated, and the explorers were expelled. As the group traversed the coast, they glimpsed cornfields and gold pieces among the local Uzita. After laborious questioning, they learned of the Apalachee people, who were said to have more of each. The crew left to find the Apalachee, where they hoped to seize riches to rival Tenochtitlan. Along the way, the group found marshes, canopies of pine trees, and several rivers, which served as borders between indigenous groups. When the expeditioners crossed rivers, they encountered different territories where they were treated as trespassers, especially when they devoured local cornfields. One day, the Timucua, led by Chief Dulcinchelin, approached the camp and communicated using signs and exchanged gifts. After painstaking deliberation, the Spaniards understood these were enemies of the Apalachee, who were willing to lead them in the right direction. Finally, in mid-June of 1528, the men came within sight of the Apalachee, the largest and most complex chiefdom occupying the Florida Peninsula, and one of the few powerful chiefdoms from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. The Apalachee had extensive agricultural practices, organized hierarchical societies, and long-distance trade routes. Their capital city, Anhaica, was at its center, where a paramount chief lived, projecting influence over several outlying capitals, and where subordinate village chiefs ruled over their surrounding small lands. Early 17th century witnesses estimate populations from 30,000 to 34,000 in the Apalachee region. Captain Narvaez ordered Cabeza de Vaca to attack an outlying Apalachee village, using women and children as hostages to trade for the village chief. To the Spaniards' surprise, they were met with an organized militant resistance and were forced to retreat. The captured chief convinced the expeditioners to go back to the coast and toward the Ate. In doing so, he protected his people by driving the Spaniards away from the capital and toward an enemy. The Apalachee would continue to maintain a stronghold in the area until the 18th century. Desperate for survival, the expedition turned for the Gulf Coast, near present-day St. Mark's, to build rafts and sail toward the coast of Mexico. Unfortunately, the rafts were again shipwrecked on the coast of modern-day Texas, with fewer than 80 survivors, and Narvaez perished en route. Near present-day Galveston, De Vaca and his men encountered a band of Karankawa, who provided the expeditioners with food and wept for their fallen men before carrying the Spaniards to their village for refuge. Soon, the castaways would overstay their welcome by failing to pull their own weight, and a relationship between guest and host deteriorated into master and slave. For the next 6 years, the castaways endured harsh, trivial work, including carrying wood, digging for roots, and fetching water, while facing violence for minor infractions. Because the Karankawa did not engage in the slave trade generally, De Vaca and his men found opportunities to leave one clan for another. By 1529, the remaining Spaniards left for New Spain and abandoned Cabeza de Vaca before he became a neutral broker for the Charucos. He traded sea beads, shells, and fruit for hides, glue, and flint before finding 3 other Spaniards and eventually making their escape together. In September 1534, de Vaca and the 3 men ventured through South Texas to present-day Mexico, where they were considered respectable healers. In their captivity, they had occasionally joined healing ceremonies and made signs of the cross on the sick and injured. Thus, they were refashioned as medicine men. In 1535, near West Texas, de Vaca completed the first recorded surgical procedure in the American Southwest. An Avavares man was struck by an arrowhead below the shoulder. De Vaca cut open the wound, extracted the weapon, and stitched the wound closed. The arrowhead and the story were passed around indigenous communities. As a result, they were met with celebration festivals and considered holy men. The Spaniards' growing reputation ultimately led to their safe return to Mexico City, as, from then on, the foursome were accompanied by thousands of natives who willingly followed de Vaca's orders throughout his travels. Women traveled ahead as guides to ensure safe passage, since the men might have been mistaken for a war party. De Vaca's experience was unusual for a European. Along the journey, he learned to speak 6 different indigenous languages and navigate a host of indigenous customs. He also found New World maize, corn, the American buffalo, and signs of copper. To survive, he adapted to indigenous life, embracing herbal cures and encouraging a softer approach to native relations. Upon his return to Mexico City, he attempted to continue ritual gift-giving, a practice he learned on his travels. However, the concept did not align with Spanish ideas of tribute and subjugation. De Vaca's stories of the indigenous interior, including tantalizing stories of great cities, prompted another round of attempted conquests. Meanwhile, sponsored by the wealth of his wife's family and the viceroy's favoritism, between 1540 and 1542, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado led an entrada that rampaged across the Southwest and Great Plains. Like all Habsburg armies, Coronado's was a truly international and multi-ethnic force, including Tlaxcalan guides, African porters, Flemish mercenaries, and even a Scottish bugler. On July 7, 1540, having reached the upper Rio Grande, Coronado's army found Huica, a small town of Zuni, Pueblo people, so named because their clustered, multi-story adobe buildings resembled Spanish villages. Pueblo Indians are believed to be descendants of the Anasazi, Mogollon, or Hohokam cultures. Acoma, Zuni, Hopi, and Tewa are among the most recognizable tribal names. Pueblos are a diverse people with some shared cultural practices. For example, Western Pueblos are matrilineal, women-owned homes and fields, while Eastern tribes such as the Acoma and Laguna are organized by moieties, dual organization. They also have as many as 7 different languages. Native to the Southwest, Pueblo culture was shaped by its harsh environment. All practiced some form of farming, but the nature of it changed based on geography. For instance, the Zuni and Hopi practiced dry farming, while others near the Rio Grande dug irrigation ditches. As the population swelled, housing structures shifted from pit houses to surface dwelling rooms with storage rooms. In the 1300s, due to the Great Drought and overpopulation, the Pueblo people migrated south to northeast Arizona, Texas, and northwestern New Mexico. The move led to another change in housing to adobe brick, multi-storied, attached homes or limestone cliff dwellings with attached adobe structures like those at Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon, and Pueblo Bonita, developed around the 13th and 14th centuries. Upon Coronado's arrival, Zuni and Spaniards alike eyed one another suspiciously. Coronado promptly had the requerimiento read, a 1513 royal decree that Spain had the divine right to possess New World territories and subjugate native peoples, demanding that the Zuni accept Spanish rule and embrace Christianity, despite their incomprehension of the words. He also informed them that resistance would be met with a loss of land, their lives, or enslavement. The Zuni reacted first by drawing a line of sacred corn not to be crossed by the Spaniards. When that did not work, they fired arrows at the Spanish party, resulting in the destruction of the village. The explorers ventured deeper into the interior of current-day New Mexico, where they met Tewa-speaking people near current-day Albuquerque. After besieging and occupying a dozen towns over the winter of 1540 to 1541, Coronado's army was led westward onto the grasslands in search of the fabled city of Quivira, central Kansas. His guide was an indigenous man, known as the Turk, whose real mission was to get the Spaniards so hopelessly lost that they could never return to terrorize the Pueblos. Along the way, the Coronado expedition came across Tiguex, scattered villages of the Tigua people. Pedro de Castaneda described the encounter, noting their clothing and labor division. While initially very hospitable, the Tigua became hostile when the adventurers continued to exhaust their food stores and one soldier raped a woman. The ensuing violence led to many fatalities. Although Coronado and some of his men made it back, his failure made clear the limits of conquest. Coronado's visit is still remembered today by the Pueblo, who depict him on a dancing horse holding a sword. Without the sugar-friendly climate of the Caribbean or large indigenous empires to co-opt and extort, the vast North American interior offered little incentive for renewed invasions. Still, smaller expeditions combed northern Mexico all the way to the Rio Grande, looking for people to enslave if no other resources could be found. Even as Spaniards were exploring the North American interior, they were simultaneously looking for strategic locations along the Pacific coast. Tales of Amazonian women in a land of paradise stoked people's imagination. For example, a Spanish writer wrote, "Know that to the right hand of the Indies was an island called California, very near the region of the terrestrial paradise, which was populated by black women, without there being any men among them. They were of vigorous bodies and strong and ardent hearts of great strength. Their arms were all of gold. In all the island there was no other metal whatsoever." In reality, the native people of California were fishermen, farmers, and hunters in much the same way as other parts of North America. There were 6 cultural areas and roughly 100 dialects before Spanish contact. In southern and central California, Serrano and Cahuilla, acorns were the primary food source, while northern California Indians, Ipai and Tipai, were hunter-slash-gatherer societies. Coastal Indians, Chumash and Tongva, relied on seafood and built canoes of driftwood. Indians of the Monterey region on the central coast, the children of the Coyote, were aware of various Spaniards' expeditions in North America from interior natives and those in Baja California. After his victory in Tenochtitlan, Cortés dispatched explorations along the Pacific coast that met with little success. In 1533, Fortun Jimenez sailed into the southeastern part of the Baja Peninsula and was met by Guayquira warriors. He and most of his men perished. Those who returned spoke of pearls and gold. Still, it was not until 1542 that veteran conquistador Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo arrived at the Bay of San Diego. Upon landing, he was met with fear and hostility, which he assuaged with gifts. The Ipe retold stories of other men killing many native people. Upon Cabrillo's death, his second-in-command, Bartolomé Ferrer, explored 1,200 miles up the Pacific coast and claimed it for Spain. Permanent occupation would not come until 1789, when an expedition led by Franciscan Father Junipero Serra established a mission in Presidio at current-day San Diego. Burdened by the mounting costs of war in America and Europe, Spain shifted its colonizing strategies toward the end of the 16th century. The popes provided religious sanction for the Iberian conquests from the start, but in his 1573 reforms, Philip II emphasized alternative methods for subjugating indigenous peoples. With the rhetoric of conquest giving way to that of pacification, converting native peoples became a greater priority. This ideological imperative was only heightened by the Reformation, as Native American converts were seen as a way of compensating for the loss of rebellious Protestant subjects in the Netherlands and elsewhere. Indeed, religious institutions like the Inquisition were always understood as mechanisms for enforcing orthodoxy. Colonists and most sedentary natives were already being ministered to by the secular clergy, which included officials from parish priests all the way to the bishops who ran the viceregal dioceses. However, along the frontier between Spanish colonies and indigenous homelands, a different set of ecclesiastical institutions led the way. Organized by mendicant orders, most prominently the Franciscans and Jesuits, missions and missionaries became the vehicles for subjugating North America's largely non-sedentary indigenous peoples. Taking vows of poverty in emulation of the apostles, most missionaries were highly educated men who combined a medieval Christian mysticism with a fervent desire to bring heathen peoples to the true faith. Embedding themselves in native communities, they learned local languages, challenged the authority of indigenous shamans, and encouraged people to live in more nucleated settlements where they could take up European-style agriculture. Seeing themselves as Christian soldiers fighting to redeem the New World from Satan's grasp, the aggressive attitude of many missionaries led them to martyrdom. One of the first, and most promising, mission fields was the Franciscan experiment in the remote northern province of New Mexico. Juan de Oñate, a Zacatecas silver baron who was related by marriage to both Montezuma and Cortés, was determined to revive Coronado's efforts to conquer the Pueblo villagers of the Rio Grande. After years of preparation, in 1598 he led 400 settlers, soldiers, and Franciscan missionaries from north of the Rio Conchos, crossed the Rio Grande at El Paso, and established headquarters at San Juan, New Mexico. This trip was different from earlier military ones. Oñate was determined to establish a permanent colony. Like other 17th-century colonies, New Mexico had violent beginnings. After Oñate sacked the mesa-top village of Acoma for resisting his invasion, his troops slaughtered nearly half of its roughly 1,500 inhabitants, including women and children. Oñate ordered 1 foot cut off every surviving male over age 15, and he enslaved the remaining women and children. This theatrical brutality reflected the Spaniards' siege mentality as they attempted to rule through force and terror. As Oñate put it in a letter, "The greatest force we possess is the prestige of the Spanish nation, by fear of which the Indians have been kept in check." Carried along indigenous trade networks, impressions of the Spaniards as cruel and treacherous strangers became widespread among Apaches, Pueblos, Navajos, and other nations. Although Oñate's colonizing efforts ultimately failed, Franciscans stayed to save the, quote, field of souls the church could not ignore. Franciscan priests compelled indigenous people to build churches, plow the fields, and perform other rigorous tasks. However, Pueblos accepted new town governments alongside their own existing ones. Priests forbade traditional native ceremonies and practices, but the Pueblo persisted by combining new and old traditions. Kachina dolls and prayer sticks were forbidden and destroyed. Meanwhile, they sought to change other key elements of native society as well. One significant cultural difference between European and indigenous cultures was their concepts of women's power and sexuality. Traditionally, Pueblo women wielded significant authority due to their control of agriculture and their fertility. In the native world, sexuality is associated with fertility and regeneration, reproduction of offspring and their labor, and the incorporation of husbands and their labor. According to historian Ramon A. Gutierrez, Pueblo women were empowered through their sexuality. Although they experienced full sexual freedom and premarital sex was common, in most cases, women were faithful upon marriage. Sexuality was not constrained by the heteronormative model, nor was it viewed as shameful or something to be hidden. Rather, it was natural, and some might say spiritual. The church sought to lessen women's power and influence, fearing that it might emasculate men. Missionaries attempted to reform native sexual behavior, especially premarital sex and polygamy, as part of the attempt to Christianize and Hispanicize them. They kept men and women in separate living quarters to ostensibly protect the women, even those who were married. Lustful thoughts were met with lashes and actions, public punishment, and humiliation. Violence, poverty, and isolation marked New Mexico's early history. Santa Fe, the first permanent European settlement in the Southwest, was established in 1610, but few Spaniards relocated to the struggling colony because of the distance from Mexico City and the rugged environment. Without mines, extracting tribute from the Pueblos and enslaving the Apaches became the main source of wealth for New Mexico's governors. For their part, some 50 Franciscan friars had established dozens of missions and secured a few hundred converts by the 1630s. Yet beneath the veneer of control and conversion lurked seething discontents. Section 9 Conclusion. European expansion into the Americas introduced both settlers and European authorities to a new situation, an abundance of land and a scarcity of labor. Portuguese, Dutch, and English ships became the conduits for Africans forced to America. The western coast of Africa, the Gulf of Guinea, and the west central coast were the sources of African captives. Wars of expansion and raiding parties produced captives who could be sold in coastal factories. African slave traders bartered for European finished goods, such as beads, cloth, rum, firearms, and metalwares.